The deadline passed at midnight Washington time, and within hours, Iranian missile batteries began firing. President Trump's 72-hour ultimatum demanding immediate cessation of attacks on American interests in the region expired not with compliance but with defiance. As Iranian Revolutionary Guard, core forces launched what military analysts are describing as one of the most sophisticated coordinated strikes against American assets in the Middle East since the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. According to reports from multiple defense officials speaking on condition of anonymity, at least 17 precision-guided ballistic missiles struck or came within lethal proximity of American military installations across Iraq and Syria in the 6 hours following the ultimatum's expiration, with additional attacks reported against maritime assets in the Persian Gulf and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The strikes represent not merely a tactical rejection of American demands, but a calculated strategic message that Iran's leadership believes the balance of deterrence in the region has shifted sufficiently, that direct confrontation with American military power no longer carries prohibitive risk. The ultimatum itself emerged from an escalating cycle of attacks and counterattacks that began 3 weeks earlier when Iranian-backed militia forces in Iraq launched drone strikes against American logistics bases supporting counterterrorism operations in western Iraq. The Trump administration responded with airstrikes against militia command facilities and weapons depots, prompting Iranian forces to escalate attacks against American personnel and infrastructure. The 72-hour deadline announced by President Trump in a brief statement from the Oval Office demanded complete cessation of all attacks on American forces and interests, withdrawal of Iranian military advisors from Iraqi territory, and public acknowledgement from Tehran that further provocations would be met with overwhelming force. The statement concluded with language unprecedented in recent American diplomatic communications, explicitly warning that failure to comply would result in strikes against Iranian homeland territory, including military command facilities and strategic infrastructure. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei responded within hours, declaring in a televised address that Iran would not be threatened or intimidated by what he characterized as empty American bluster, and that Iranian forces would continue defending their interests and those of their regional partners regardless of American ultimatums. What makes the Iranian response particularly significant is not simply that Tehran rejected American demands, but the manner in which that rejection was delivered through military action specifically calibrated to challenge American credibility while remaining below the threshold that would automatically trigger major retaliation. The question now facing military planners and political decision-makers in Washington is not whether Iran has crossed a red line, but whether the United States can effectively respond to calculated provocations designed to exploit the space between tolerable harassment and intolerable direct warfare. This calculation represents the central challenge emerging from the failed ultimatum and the Iranian military response that followed. The missile strikes that began in the hours after midnight targeted American installations with a level of precision and tactical sophistication that surprised defense analysts who had previously assessed Iranian ballistic missile capabilities as primarily useful for area bombardment rather than precision targeting of specific military infrastructure. According to Pentagon sources speaking to defense-oriented media outlets, the initial wave of strikes employed FAT-110 and Zulfiqar missiles, both solid-fuel systems capable of precision guidance through terminal phase maneuvering that complicates interception by point defense systems. The missiles were fired from positions in western Iran and from mobile launchers operating in Iraqi territory, creating multiple attack vectors that divided American defensive resources across geographically separated installations. The primary target complex appears to have been Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, the same installation struck by Iranian missiles in January 2020, following the American drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. Military sources indicate that at least 9 missiles were fired at Al-Assad, with American Patriot batteries and Avenger short-range air defense systems engaging multiple inbound threats. According to initial damage assessments, at least 3 missiles evaded interception and struck within the base perimeter, damaging aircraft shelters, ammunition storage facilities, and support infrastructure. Additional strikes targeted American positions at Al-Tanf in southeastern Syria near the Iraqi and Jordanian borders, aimed at smaller outposts housing American Special Operations Forces and military advisors throughout western Iraq. The attacks reveal several concerning developments in Iranian offensive capabilities and operational planning. First, the missiles demonstrated accuracy levels significantly improved from systems employed in previous attacks, suggesting that Iranian efforts to enhance guidance systems through indigenous development and potential technology transfers from external suppliers have achieved meaningful results. Second, the attacks employed saturation tactics designed to overwhelm American point defense systems by presenting multiple simultaneous threats that exceed available interceptors, approach that exploits known limitations in deployed defensive networks. Third, the timing and sequencing of strikes suggests detailed intelligence about American force dispositions and defensive postures, indicating that Iranian surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities provide actionable targeting information for precision strike planning. Perhaps most significant from a strategic perspective is what the attacks reveal about Iranian confidence in their ability to calibrate military action below levels that would trigger major American retaliation while still inflicting meaningful costs and demonstrating operational reach. The strikes caused infrastructure damage and reportedly resulted in injuries to American personnel, though Pentagon spokesmen have declined to provide specific casualty figures pending notification of families and completion of damage assessments. The Iranian approach appears designed to impose ongoing costs on American military presence in the region while avoiding the kind of mass casualty attack that would create domestic political pressure in the United States for comprehensive retaliation against Iranian homeland targets. This calibration reflects sophisticated strategic thinking about American domestic political constraints and decision-making processes. Iranian military planners appear to have concluded that the Trump administration, facing domestic political pressures and lacking clear congressional authorization for expanded military operations against Iran, would find it difficult to justify major escalation in response to attacks that damage equipment and infrastructure, but avoid triggering the kind of emotional response that mass American casualties would generate. The calculation suggests Iranian confidence that they can continue imposing costs through persistent medium-intensity attacks without crossing thresholds that would force major American military response. The failure of the ultimatum strategy creates multiple cascading problems for American deterrence posture throughout the region. When the President of the United States issues a direct demand with explicit consequences for non-compliance, the failure to enforce those consequences when the deadline passes without compliance undermines American credibility. Not merely regarding Iranian behavior, but in every other regional confrontation where adversaries must calculate whether American threats represent genuine commitments or rhetorical posturing subject to revision when confronted with actual costs and risks. Regional partners including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel closely monitor American responses to Iranian provocations as indicators of whether American security commitments retain sufficient credibility to justify their own strategic alignments and policy decisions. When ultimatums fail to produce compliance and the threatened consequences do not materialize in commensurate form, allies begin exploring alternative security arrangements, and adversaries grow bolder in challenging American interests. According to diplomatic sources in Gulf capitals speaking to regional media outlets, the ultimatum's failure has generated significant anxiety among American partners who interpret Iranian defiance as evidence that Tehran no longer considers American military threats sufficiently credible to constrain their regional activities. These concerns are amplified by Iranian actions beyond the direct missile strikes, including reported mining operations near commercial shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf, increased harassment of American naval vessels by Revolutionary Guard Corps fast boats, and what military intelligence sources describe as preparation activities at Iranian missile sites, suggesting potential readiness for additional large-scale strikes if the confrontation continues escalating. The Trump administration now faces a difficult strategic choice with no attractive options available. responding with overwhelming force against Iranian homeland targets, risks sparking a wider regional conflict that could draw in Iranian partners including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, Houthi forces in Yemen, and militia groups throughout Iraq, potentially forcing American military commitments far beyond what domestic political support would sustain. Responding with limited strikes against Iranian proxy forces or isolated military facilities maintains the status quo of tit-for-tat escalation without restoring deterrence or demonstrating that ultimatums carry genuine consequences when defied. Choosing not to respond with military action following the explicit 72-hour deadline and threatened consequences would represent a major defeat for American deterrence credibility that adversaries throughout the region and globally would note carefully when making their own calculations about how to respond to American demands. Defense Secretary sources indicate internal debates are underway about potential response options, including strikes against Iranian naval facilities in the Persian Gulf, targeting of Revolutionary Guard Corps command facilities, cyber operations against Iranian military communications networks, and coordinated actions with regional partners to impose economic costs through expanded sanctions and diplomatic isolation. However, each option carries significant risks and uncertain effectiveness given the dynamics that have emerged through the current crisis. Iranian forces have demonstrated they can continue imposing costs on American interests through distributed attacks from multiple geographic positions, creating a whack-a-mole dynamic where American responses against individual facilities or units fail to meaningfully degrade Iranian overall operational capacity. The economic dimensions of the confrontation are beginning to manifest as insurance rates for commercial shipping transiting the Persian Gulf have increased dramatically, and energy markets are responding to escalation risks, with crude oil prices rising approximately 15% since the ultimatum was announced. Approximately one-fifth of global petroleum supplies transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and even temporary disruptions to shipping through Iranian harassment or mine-laying operations would create significant economic impacts extending far beyond the immediate region. Iranian officials have repeatedly threatened to close the strait in response to American military action, and while military analysts generally assess that American and allied naval forces could maintain the shipping channel open through sustained operations, the costs and risks associated with protecting commercial traffic through a contested waterway would be substantial. The confrontation is also generating tensions within the American domestic political landscape as congressional leaders demand briefings on administration military planning and question whether existing authorizations provide legal basis for expanded operations against Iranian forces. Some members have called for new congressional authorization before any major military action, while others argue the administration possesses sufficient authority under existing statutes to respond to attacks on American forces. These political dynamics create additional constraints on decision-making, as administration officials must navigate not only the military and diplomatic dimensions of the crisis, but also domestic political opposition and legal questions about war powers and authorization. International reactions to the failed ultimatum reveal the complex diplomatic landscape surrounding the confrontation. European allies have issued statements calling for de-escalation and renewed diplomatic engagement, while avoiding explicit endorsement of either American or Iranian positions, reflecting their interest in preventing wider conflict that would disrupt energy markets and generate refugee flows, while maintaining sufficient distance from American military actions to preserve their own diplomatic and economic relationships with Tehran. Russia and China have issued statements criticizing American threats and calling the ultimatum an example of counterproductive unilateral coercion, while likely providing Iran with intelligence and diplomatic support behind the scenes. Regional actors are positioning themselves based on their assessments of how the confrontation will conclude, with some seeking to exploit the situation to advance their own interests, while others attempt to position themselves as mediators or remain neutral to avoid becoming targets themselves. The question now facing decision-makers in Washington and Tehran is where this escalation cycle leads, and whether either side possesses clear pathways to achieving their objectives without triggering consequences. Neither can accept. The Trump administration's goal appears to be restoring deterrence and forcing Iranian restraint through demonstrations of American willingness to impose costs for attacks on American interests. Iranian objectives appear centered on establishing that American military presence in the region carries ongoing risks and costs that make maintaining those deployments politically unsustainable over time, while demonstrating to regional audiences that Iranian power cannot be constrained through American threats. These objectives are fundamentally incompatible, with each side requiring the other to accept outcomes they have explicitly rejected. The failed ultimatum has not resolved the underlying confrontation, but has instead intensified it by making retreat more difficult for both sides. President Trump cannot simply accept Iranian defiance without appearing weak and inviting further provocations, while Iranian leadership cannot comply with American demands after publicly rejecting them without appearing to surrender under pressure. This dynamic creates escalation pressures where each side feels compelled to demonstrate resolve through additional actions that further raise stakes and narrow the space for de-escalation or diplomatic resolution. Military planners on both sides are now gaming out additional escalation phases, including potential American strikes against Iranian homeland targets, Iranian responses through attacks on Gulf shipping or American naval assets, activation of Iranian proxy forces throughout the region, and potential involvement of Iranian partners in Lebanon and Yemen in widening the confrontation. Each escalation phase carries risks of miscalculation or unintended consequences that could transform a managed confrontation into uncontrolled regional conflict. The historical record of ultimatums and brinkmanship provides little comfort, as numerous conflicts have escalated beyond what either side initially intended once pride, credibility, and domestic political pressures override rational cost-benefit analysis. Intelligence sources indicate both sides are positioning assets and preparing for potential further escalation, even while public statements emphasize restraint and proportional response. American carrier strike groups are repositioning in the region, bomber aircraft are being deployed to regional bases, and special operations forces are reportedly conducting enhanced readiness preparations. Iranian forces have dispersed mobile missile launchers to reduce vulnerability to American strikes, activated reserve units, and according to some reports may be preparing defensive positions around critical infrastructure and leadership facilities. These military preparations create their own escalation dynamics, as each side observes the other's movements and responds with their own force posture adjustments, creating a spiral where defensive preparations appear threatening and generate reciprocal responses. The next 72 hours may prove as consequential as the ultimatum period itself, as both sides assess their options and determine whether to pursue additional escalation or seek diplomatic off-ramps that would allow step back from the brink without appearing to capitulate. The challenge is that genuine de-escalation would require both sides to simultaneously retreat from positions they have publicly committed to defending, and neither appears willing to make the first move that would be interpreted as weakness, inviting further pressure. What happens when an American president's ultimatum fails and the threatened consequences do not materialize in forms that restore deterrence remains an open and deeply concerning question. The answer will be written not in diplomatic statements, but in the military decisions made in Tehran and Washington over the days ahead, as this dangerous confrontation continues evolving toward destinations neither side may fully control once set in motion.